Hello and welcome to UWO Now. I'm Wendell Ray. UWO Now is the place where we discuss relevant and interesting topics with the students, staff, and faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. In August and September of every year, students return to schools and campuses around the United States, and it's no different here at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. But what challenges and what opportunities are out there for American colleges and universities and for students? What are leaders at campuses doing to meet the needs of today's student? We'll talk about that and other things and dive into what's happening here at UWO with UWO Chancellor Andrew Leavitt, who's our guest today. Thank you so much, Chancellor Leavitt, for coming by and talking to us. Good to see you.
It's my pleasure, Wendell. Thank you for having me.
Let's talk in general about some of the differences between today's student and the student that we were when we went to school. I don't know how old you are. I don't want to date you or anything like that. But even the student 15 years ago is different than today's student. What are some of the differences, and how do universities meet those challenges? Because like any business with a client, and if you look at a university, a student is your client, you got to understand their position and what they want. How is it different? Is it different at all for leaders at universities and colleges across the United States as they try to meet the needs of today's student?
I think that's a great question, Wendell, and it's one that I'm constantly wrestling with the answer because you need to know what the nature is of the student that's in front of you. And you're right, it has changed remarkably over the years. In the interest of full disclosure, I started college 40 years ago in the fall of 1982. And I as well. All right. And certainly things were different then. I went to a large land-grant university out west, and there wasn't, the idea of student support just didn't exist in those days, that if you went to faculty office hours, but for the most part, they didn't have a lot of resources available if you struggled. And, so people would say, well, geez, students back then were more resilient. The student success numbers at universities and colleges at that time were not good. Matter of fact, if you go back 40 years here, our retention rate was much lower. Our graduation rate was much lower than it is today. And I think part of that was it was still the Wild West where everybody was considered to be an adult. And they didn't really account for the differences in backgrounds of people or their level of preparedness coming in. So if you fast forward to 1994 in January, when I started as an untenured assistant professor, things began to change in that I think that colleges and universities realized and understood that they had some responsibility to make sure that students perform, particularly those who self-identified that they wanted to, they wanted to change. And so we started putting some of those systems in. Now, in this day and age, you have a full suite of wraparound services, ranging from everything from obviously the tutoring and writing centers to some pretty significant mental health resources that we make available to students. Is it enough? Never, it will never be enough, but it is. People may be surprised that we have 10 mental health full-time counselors here with full caseloads here at UW Oshkosh. Students bring their histories with them when they come, and it's incumbent upon us, particularly when we enter into the contract with them and that they pay tuition and they come here to learn, that we do everything we can to help them learn. So oftentimes I've heard people talk about the resiliency of students, that what I would say pre-COVID is that students were maybe a little less resilient today than they were then, but our student success numbers are better. But I would also say students at the time, in more recent years, have been more academically prepared than I would say I was when I left high school.
Is that right? Now that's interesting to me.
Yeah.
As someone who teaches and who thinks that I was a better student than anybody who ever existed, but clearly wasn't. But Why do you say that? How do you feel that students today are better prepared?
Well, the numbers in terms of, again, if you look at a 30-year span of retention and graduation numbers, progression numbers, student success numbers, I would say they were generally on a glide path of improvement over all those years, except when COVID hit. And I think COVID has just been an absolute game changer, and it's just scrambled everything.
Let's just put a pause right there, because that in itself is a show by itself.
Right, that's its own show.
But let's talk briefly about that. Let's go back to February of, 20? Yeah. And, we started hearing numbers creeping up. March creeps around, numbers are exploding. What's going on in your office with you and the folks that you work with in administration? What were you talking about, and how are you trying to prepare for COVID?
We began our preparations for COVID back in December of 19. Is when we started to bring together our emergency operations center.
Wow.
To do that. We could see this coming.
When there had been 3 or 4 reported cases, what made you decide to jump in then?
Because it was coming in from both coasts. It was a major outbreaks in other parts of the world. We knew that it was coming our way. We have a responsibility to be good stewards, which means we need to be prepared for contingencies. What people may not realize or have forgotten, we went through a norovirus outbreak in our residence halls just about a year before that. And if you've ever been on a cruise ship where you can't leave your cabin for the obvious reason, you know what norovirus is. And we had thousands of students impacted by norovirus. And so we actually had already been through this in a very limited and not nearly as serious way.
Sure.
In terms of managing it. So we kind of knew that this was going to be an issue. And of course, at the UW system, they also anticipated that this was could be a very big potential problem. Then we get into March, and when the University of Washington on the West Coast closed, they were the very first institution to close, to go completely online.
I remember that.
Then the dominoes began to fall. First the West Coast, then the East Coast, and then it's, like I say, like this tsunami, it met in the middle in the Midwest. And then, of course, that was March 11th, which was a Wednesday. I remember it well. That's when the NBA canceled the rest of its season.
Yeah.
Then you know it's serious because something like that just doesn't happen. So we knew we were in by March 13th. We had declared that by the following week we'd be putting out an announcement, and we gave our faculty about 3 days to prepare to leave the campus, gather the technology you needed. You're going to be at home for a while. And then I have said this many times publicly that the greatest and most gratifying moment in my professional life as chancellor or professor or anything else that I have done was watching our extraordinary faculty pivot from being completely in the classroom to being online in less than 2 weeks.
With having no idea
how to do it.
2 days before how to do it.
Exactly. And here's the other extraordinary part of that. No one complained. Everybody knew what they needed to do. They knew that they needed this was an emergency, that they needed to move quickly. From every single employee at this university, it acted, I think, with great impact and with a great sense of urgency. And so it was an amazing time from that respect. Very scary time in the sense that we didn't know what was going to happen. We hadn't had a single case on campus when we vacated this campus, which seems odd now, but at the time that was really sort of the direction everybody was going. And then, of course, COVID really showed up with a vengeance in September of 20 when we reopened face to face. But at that point, we had a much better understanding of the disease. We knew how to manage it, and then that, of course, is its own show. That fall of managing COVID cases on campus with isolation residence halls and trying to keep people as safe as possible, and at the same time try to have some sense of normalcy.
Well, we have now come to a point where we're still getting COVID cases, but we started this discussion about COVID and its impact on students and the universities and so forth. Now, 2 years later, do we know enough to be able to evaluate that period? And what do you think was the impact of COVID here and across the United States as far as colleges and universities are concerned?
Well, I think it broke a lot of norms, and some of those norms probably needed to be broken, but other norms, not so much. My biggest concern is the learning gaps that opened up, certainly with our own university students, because the way that we went completely online isn't necessarily consistent with the best practices of an online course. You have to remember it was about just being remote, and so these were not courses that were designed with online pedagogy in mind. Then you look at the K-12 system, and that's really where the long-term impact is going to be, because I have grandchildren down in Georgia who were in school at that time. One was in first grade, the other was in kindergarten, and having a kindergarten student on a computer.
Hey, I remember my I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you,
Yeah.
but I remember my sister, my niece was in the first grade, and she said, God bless that teacher, because all those students are doing when the cameras come on and saying, hey, Johnny, hey, Johnny, and there's little to no instruction going on. It's hard. It's like herding cats, trying to figure out how to
It was
teach.
impossible.
Yeah.
It was impossible in many ways. And I'm married to a nurse, and nurses get a lot of credit, and rightfully so, from how they responded to COVID. But I'll tell you a group that does not get enough credit, and that is K-12 teachers. Mm-hmm. What they had to endure and how they tried to keep it going. In many cases, they were successful in doing so. But it's created learning gaps, and those learning gaps are a wave, if you will, that's rolling through the grades up. And I'm a big fan of the United Way, and I can give this plug now. I hope everybody contributes to the Oshkosh Area United Way campaign. And United Way has done many studies where they show that by the third grade, you switch from learning to read to learn. And if you don't learn to read, you can't read to learn. And so there's a lot of kids in that period of time, maybe who have deficiencies now, that we really need to pay some attention to. And they do roll into college, and they will eventually. So we're getting a less prepared student, if you will, coming into college. And so it's our responsibility to meet students where they're at and to try to close those gaps.
You're listening to UWO Now. I'm Wendell Ray, and I'm talking today with University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh Chancellor Andrew Leavitt, talking about the challenges faced by many colleges and universities across the country. And we'll get into some specifics here at UWO and what some of the plans are for this semester and beyond as we continue our conversation here today. In August, President Biden announced that he was going to implement some cuts on student debt, make some decisions about what people would owe, what they had to pay back. Some yays and nays out there. What from a university standpoint can you talk to us about today about student debt?
Great subject. Student debt, in my mind, it can be a largely misunderstood subject. So I'm always happy to speak about it. And I want to speak with a few facts. These numbers are 2 years old. It's been that long since I've really looked carefully at the UWO numbers, so I want to qualify that. But about 65% of our students take out student loans, and about 35% do not. So it's not ubiquitous. Not everybody takes out a student loan. So 65%, that's a big number. But nevertheless, in my mind, student loans are a tool that make it possible for students and families to invest in their students' education. And you're obviously taking from the future in order to make the possibility true now, and then you have to pay it back. Our students have a very low default rates, about 3% or so, the last time I had checked. That's how many of our students are in default within 3 years of graduating from college. Where the student loan problem is a problem here, and those students who are in default tend to be students who come to college and don't finish. Most of them, of course, will leave after their first year, and they have taken out student debt, and then they have neither the means nor really the incentive to try to pay it back. So in this country, the average student loan in default is around $10,000. And that's the reason why that number, President Biden's number, is relevant. That'll take care of, it'll retire the debt of half of the people who are in default, the 10,000. So here at Oshkosh, affordability is obviously a big issue. Wisconsin just published a study, UW Wisconsin, that suggests that we are the most affordable education in the Midwest. If people really want to know the numbers, here at UW Oshkosh, for a year's worth of tuition is $6,400. It's been frozen for almost a decade, since 2012.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's
$6,400 is our tuition.
That's about what I paid at IU.
Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah, a long time ago. And so then there are other expenses in the cost of attendance. So to be totally open, so you have a book allowance of about $1,000.
Okay.
The segregated fees, this is the fees the students pay for services on campus, particularly services they vote on, that they run, it's approximately $1,250. Then you've got in that same budget, you've got a $2,600 allowance because we know students need to buy stuff, and this is stuff that they would buy, and then approximately $7,800 for room and board. And this is an annual cost of attendance. So it costs just about $20,000 a year in that cost of attendance budget to go to UW Oshkosh. And then you look at how do you assemble the resources to pay for that, and that's the reason why everyone needs to fill out the FAFSA. That's the federal student aid application that qualifies you for all sorts of federal dollars. And it's amazing now students are not doing that. They're not filling it out, and so they're.
Do we know why?
I got to be honest, I do not know why. A part of it, of course, you have to have your parents participate in that. You have to be able to divulge family, financial information, and there may be issues behind that. But that's very important because that makes you eligible for the Pell Grant if you have a low enough expected family contribution. So student loans are important because they close the gap, a lot of gaps. And interestingly enough, the maximum amount you can borrow in 4 years here at UW Oshkosh through the federal guaranteed student loan program is about $36,000. That's it. So if a student accrues more than $36,000 of debt, what that tells me is that they consumed what was available in the federal system, and then they went out to a bank or to some other lending agency and they borrowed money on top of that. And so when someone has $78,000 of student debt, that's outside of the normal guaranteed student loan program.
And we're talking about for a four-year degree.
For a 4-year degree, yeah. And then it becomes a matter of choice. The reason why we have comprehensive institutions like Whitewater, like Oshkosh, like La Crosse, Green Bay, is because they offer a very affordable, if you have the money, a very affordable option when you compare us to private schools.
Mm-hmm.
In private schools, you tend to be very high tuition, high discount, and offer big scholarships. But at the end of the day, it's what's the size of the check you're writing for your education. So after all of our discount price, if you will, for in terms of after all the aid is applied, is much lower than that $20,000.
You're listening to UWO Now. I'm Wendell Ray, and we're talking today with UWO Chancellor Andrew Leavitt. We'll be back in just a second.